Okay, Schopenhauer famously loathed Hegel. Yet this was not always the case. In 1813, he was lent a copy of Hegel's Science of Logic, but returned it, noting that he did not read such things. In 1820, however, he was more positive and remarked that Hegel had the kindness to approve the topic of his test lecture at the University of Berlin with the greatest willingness. Later, though, things changed dramatically, and Schopenhauer unleashed what Nietzsche calls his unintelligent rage against Hegel. Schopenhauer accuses Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel of being sophists who lack intellectual honesty, yet he judges Hegel to be the worst. For the others are at least men of talent, whereas Hegel is a crude, mindless charlatan who serves up nothing but nonsense. Moreover, Hegel produces his nonsense to throw dust in his readers' eyes and mystify them. Indeed, he is like a cuttlefish, creating around itself a cloud of darkness so that no one can see what it is. I'll let you think about that. Hegel engages in mystification, we are told, to deceive readers into thinking he's more profound than he is, and thereby to secure his academic position. In this way, Schopenhauer remarks, the interest of the person is satisfied, that of the truth betrayed. The same self-interest leads Hegel to venerate the state as the ethical organism in which people fulfill their determination like the bee in the beehive. Hegel thus turned philosophy, the daughter of reason, into a tool of the state's purposes, of obscurantism, and in so doing he hid behind the most senseless gibberish that has ever been heard, at least outside the madhouse. Now, Schopenhauer was proud and cantankerous, to say the least. But he especially disliked Hegel because he regarded Hegel and his philosophy as the source for all of his failures. Schopenhauer held Hegel responsible for his lack of academic success and the failure of his major work, The World as Will and Representation, to attract the wide readership he felt it deserved. Two events in particular provoked Schopenhauer's resentment towards his philosophical antichrist. First, after requesting the right to hold lectures at the University of Berlin, Schopenhauer was permitted to give a test lecture on the 23rd of March 1820 to an audience that included Hegel. During the discussion, Hegel and Schopenhauer had a minor dispute about the motivation of animals and the meaning of the term animal functions. Nonetheless, Hegel voted to allow Schopenhauer to hold lectures. Moreover, he did so in full knowledge that Schopenhauer had asked that his lectures in the summer semester be scheduled at the same time as Hegel's, a request that outraged other colleagues. When Hegel and Schopenhauer gave their lectures, students flocked to hear Hegel, but only 5 turned up to hear Schopenhauer. He discontinued the course before the semester ended and eventually left Berlin in May 1822. He returned in 1825 and with characteristic stubbornness again scheduled his lectures at the same time as Hegel's, with a similar result. No philosophy students came to hear him, and in winter 1826-7 he attracted just 3 medical students. Schopenhauer blamed Hegel for the failure of his lectures, even though, according to David Cartwright, Schopenhauer's biographer, Hegel did nothing personally to derail Schopenhauer's academic career. Schopenhauer's hatred of Hegel then became more intense over the years until in On Will and Nature, 1836, he launched the first of his numerous public diatribes against his enemy. The second event to fuel Schopenhauer's hatred was his failure in 1840 to win a prize in Denmark for his essay on the basis of morals, even though his was the only entry. One reason listed by the Danish Society for not awarding the prize was that in the essay, I quote, "several distinguished philosophers of recent times are mentioned in such an indecent fashion as to provoke just and grave offense." Schopenhauer took this to refer principally to Hegel, so in the preface of a later work that contained that essay, he reaffirmed his unqualifying, damning judgment on Hegel's pestilential influence. Okay, enough of the humor. Yet Schopenhauer also had philosophical disagreements with Hegel. Above all, he contends, the fundamental thought of Hegel's pseudo-philosophy is absurd, namely, to make universal concepts which we abstract from empirical intuition into the primary, the original, the truly real. For Hegel, Schopenhauer states, thinking itself in the proper sense or concepts were to be identical with the essence in itself of things. Accordingly, logic was to be at the same time true metaphysics, and so we only needed to think or let concepts rule in order to know how the world outside is absolutely constituted. This, however, according to Schopenhauer, has the absurd consequence that, I quote, everything haunting a skull would at once be true and real. Furthermore, Schopenhauer notes, Hegel ignores Kant's insight that concepts get their content from sensuous intuition, and without the latter are empty. This, in turn, reduces Hegel's texts to meaningless verbiage. Another problem is that Hegel abandons the principle governing the normal employment of reason, that there should be reasons or grounds for our thoughts. Schopenhauer cites the following lines from Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit to support this charge. That's number one. This is Hegel. It is not difficult to see that the way of asserting a proposition, adducing reasons, Gründe, for it, and in the same way refuting its opposite by reasons, is not the form in which truth can appear. Truth is its own self-movement. Schopenhauer then adds, it's not difficult to see that whoever puts forward such a thing is a shameless charlatan who wants to fool the simpletons. As Schopenhauer points out, Hegel replaces thought based on reasons with the self-movement of concepts. Such movement, however, remains incomprehensible to Schopenhauer, and he claims is designed to make the young stupid and wholly incapable of any thought. For Hegel's monstrous conjunction of words cancel and contradict each other so that the spirit torments itself in vain to connect some thought to them until it finally sinks down, exhausted. Equally reprehensible, Schopenhauer thinks, is the fact that the self-movement of the concepts, or the pure self-thinking of the absolute idea, is equated by Hegel with the immediate apprehension of the divine. For this confirms that Hegel aims to pass off the matters of state religion as the findings of philosophy. A further reason for Schopenhauer's rejection of Hegel is that the latter understands the world to be governed by reason or the idea, whereas Schopenhauer insists it's the expression of an irrational, blindly striving will. Hegel's philosophy, especially his philosophy of history, thus exemplifies the optimism we see in Leibniz, and to which Schopenhauer opposes his implacably pessimistic view that life is not rational at all, but mainly full of misery, Elend. For Schopenhauer, history shows the same suffering and the same underlying will in all humanity, in ancient as well as in modern times, in the Orient as well as the Occident. By contrast, Hegel understands world history, in Schopenhauer's words, as a whole following a plan that leads to a fat, comfortable, and substantial state. Such an understanding betrays a shallow optimism because it substitutes the fiction of historical progress for the fact that the basic quality of the human heart and head, many bad ones, few good, remain unchanged. Schopenhauer also complains that Hegel does not understand science or nature. After their disagreement in 1820 about the term animal functions, Schopenhauer refers to Hegel as Monsieur Know-Nothing, Monsieur Nichtswisser. In the first preface of the two fundamental problems of ethics, he then subjects 3 passages on nature from Hegel's Encyclopedia to his withering critique. And if you know Popper's Open Society and His Enemies, you'll recognize these passages that Popper took from Schopenhauer. In the first passage, Hegel maintains mistakenly that magnetizing iron alters its density or specific gravity. This is number 2. This is Hegel. When a bar of iron, evenly balanced on its fulcrum, is magnetized, it loses its equilibrium and shows itself to be heavier at one pole than at another. Here, the one part is so affected that without its changing its volume, it becomes heavier. The matter, without increase in its mass, has thus become specifically heavier, spezifisch schwerer. In response, Schopenhauer delights in pointing out the error and mocking the syllogism he takes to lead to it. This syllogism proceeds as follows, number 3. If a bar supported at its center subsequently becomes heavier on one side, then it falls to that side. But an iron bar falls to one side once it has been magnetized, therefore it has become heavier in that place. This is a worthy analogue, Schopenhauer writes, to the following inference. All geese have 2 legs. You have 2 legs. Therefore you're a goose. And it shows Hegel's profound lack of understanding, Unverstand. In the second passage, Hegel maintains that gravitation directly contradicts the law of inertia, for by virtue of the former, matter strives out of itself towards the other. For Schopenhauer, however, neither being attracted nor being pushed away by another body contradicts the law of inertia, but each presupposes that law. For each involves an external cause that removes or alters the body's current inertial state. Indeed, Schopenhauer insists, the law of inertia flows immediately from that of causality and is just its converse. For whereas the latter law states that every alteration is brought about by a cause, the law of inertia simply states that when no cause intervenes, no alteration occurs. Anything that would contradict the law of inertia, as Hegel claims of gravitation, would thus contradict the law of causality too. In so doing, it would contradict what is certain a priori, and to advocate that is once again to display a lack of understanding, indeed impudent stupidity, Albernheit. In the third passage, Hegel notes that those who explain elasticity through the invention of pores, P-O-R-E, admit in principle that matter is perishable, not absolute. Yet he continues, number 4, in practice this admission is resisted, so that in fact matter is regarded only as affirmative, as absolutely self-subsistent, eternal. This error springs from the general error of the understanding that what is metaphysical is only a thought thing. Schopenhauer's response to these remarks is characteristically blunt. 5. What fool, Dummkopf, has ever conceded that matter is perishable? And which one calls the opposite an error? That matter persists, that it does not come into existence and perish like everything else, this is a cognition a priori, as firm and certain as any mathematical one. Hegel, the Danish Academy's distinguished philosopher, thus again shows his ignorance and proves himself to be a teacher of absurdities. Schopenhauer did not have extensive knowledge of Hegel's philosophy. Yet he quotes from Hegel's Phenomenology and Encyclopedia, and expressions he attributes to Hegel also indicate some familiarity with the latter's texts. So how well did he understand Hegel? Consider first Schopenhauer's objections to Hegel's claims that bodies can become heavier through being magnetized, that gravitation contradicts the law of inertia, and that matter is perishable. As already noted, Hegel is wrong to claim that the magnetic inclination or downward dip of a balanced iron bar is due to an increase in density. Schopenhauer, however, is himself wrong to assert that Hegel's claim rests on a faulty syllogism. Hegel's argument is not that magnetism increases the density and weight of one end of the bar because whatever falls to one side does through becoming heavier. He thinks that magnetism in particular increases density, and that this example disproves a theory in contemporary physics. According to this theory, material parts of the same size always weigh the same, and so do not differ in density. Bodies of the same weight thus have the same number of material parts, and so differ in volume and density only because of the number of empty spaces or pores they contain. So if you've got the same weight, you've got the same number of parts. If you've got different density, you must have more empty space in there. And so the body is filled up with pores. That's the theory that Hegel doesn't like and wants to disprove. For Hegel, however, number 6, such pores are an invention, Erdichtung, made necessary by the initial a priori invention that matter comprises parts identical in weight and volume. He believes, however, that magnetizing iron proves both inventions to be erroneous and redundant. It does so by showing that a body can change its density without changing its volume or the number of identical parts it is supposed to contain, because the matter constituting the body itself becomes denser. This change in the matter's density in turn removes the need for pores in the body. Now, the fact that Hegel is mistaken in claiming that magnetism alters density doesn't undermine his philosophical point. That matter differs in density, is itself more or less densely packed, and pores are thus an unnecessary invention of the understanding with no basis in experience. Schopenhauer, however, shows no grasp of or interest in Hegel's argument. He's concerned only to highlight what he sees as Hegel's unintelligent reliance on an obviously invalid syllogism. One reason, beside personal animosity, why Schopenhauer is not interested in Hegel's argument is that he accepts a principle Hegel rejects, namely that matter is unchanging. This is apparent in Schopenhauer's brusque dismissal of Hegel's claim in the third passage that matter is perishable, not absolute, because it contains the moment of negation. For Schopenhauer, there is no room for argument here. The states of matter can change, but matter is itself unalterable. Indeed, the idea that matter could change is unimaginable because the form of our understanding does not admit it. Schopenhauer thus sees no need to examine Hegel's conception of matter because he knows a priori that he's right and that Hegel is thus a Dummkopf. Now, Schopenhauer is obviously basing his idea here on Kant's first analogy and the idea of the permanence of substance, and then how that's fleshed out in the metaphysical foundations of natural science. Schopenhauer's critique of Hegel's second passage also rests on his a priori certainty, namely, number 7, that gravitation presupposes rather than contradicts the law of inertia. In Schopenhauer's view, when one body attracts another, it changes the latter's inertial state through external causality. Since Schopenhauer regards such causality as a necessary form of the principle of sufficient reason, and as a necessary condition of experience, he sees no need to examine why Hegel thinks that a gravitating body strives out of itself to unite with other bodies. In his view, Hegel simply lacks understanding of causality, inertia, and gravity. Hegel's conception of gravity is, however, more subtle than Schopenhauer realizes. 8. In his philosophy of nature, Hegel derives matter logically from space, time, and motion, and so understands matter to be inherently in motion. Just as there is no motion without matter, so too there is no matter without motion. Material bodies are indeed inert, träge, insofar as they preserve their state of motion or relative rest, until that state is changed by the external impact of another body. Yet they also exhibit their own immanent motion towards other bodies, motion that is not the result of any external cause. Such gravitational motion for Hegel is evident in bodies that fall freely, as he says, to the ground, according to Galileo's law. Note that in contrast to Schopenhauer, Hegel does not understand gravity to be a force. It is simply a body's inherent motion toward other bodies. Bodies are thus not attracted by one another, but actively gravitate towards one another. Note too that every inert body gravitates in this way. In this respect, Parce Karl Popper, Hegel acknowledges the identity of inert and gravitating mass. Yet in his view, inertial and gravitational motion are also at odds with one another. For the former, inertial motion, preserves its identity until it is altered by an external cause, whereas gravitation is matter's inherent endeavour to lose its identity in a union with other matter. Gravitating matter thus challenges the principle of identity to which abstract understanding clings. Schopenhauer, who in many respects exemplifies such understanding, remains largely ignorant of Hegel's account of matter and gravity. Yet he is correct about some of his claims about Hegel's logic. Hegel does maintain that thought discloses the essentialities of things and that accordingly logic coincides with metaphysics. Parce Schopenhauer, however, this does not mean that everything haunting a skull would at once be true and real. Thought discloses the truth, the nature of being, only when it proceeds in the right way. More precisely, thought reveals the nature of being when it frees itself from all assumptions or presuppositions that usually determine and that can distort our comprehension of the world. For Hegel, philosophy or science should thus be preceded by total presuppositionlessness, Voraussetzungslosigkeit, a requirement that is fulfilled when thought freely, number 9, abstracts from everything and grasps its own pure abstraction, the simplicity of thought. This simplicity, in turn, is just the indeterminate being of thought, thought as sheer indeterminate being. By setting aside all assumptions about itself, therefore, thought reduces itself to pure being and so becomes the thought of such being. In Hegel's words, the beginning of the logic may presuppose nothing, must not be mediated by anything or have a ground. It must therefore be simply an immediacy, or rather immediacy itself, pure and simple being. The beginning is therefore pure being, and logic coincides with metaphysics, the science of being. That passage was from the Science of Logic. Hegel's argument here is reminiscent of Descartes' cogito argument in the Meditations, number 10. For Descartes, if we strip away all we take for granted about thought and the world, we are left with I am, I exist, the existence of the I that is irreducible so long as I think that I am something. Hegel, however, takes the reduction of thought a stage further and removes the I itself. This leaves us simply with thought as being, pure being, without any further determination. Being that is the beginning of a new metaphysical logic. In contrast to Hegel, Schopenhauer rejects the idea that philosophy can be presuppositionless. In philosophy, he writes, every method that is allegedly presuppositionless is hot air, since something must always be regarded as given in order to proceed from it. From Hegel's perspective, however, this assertion is itself merely a dogmatic presupposition that prevents further reflection on the matter. And, like Descartes, Hegel thinks that thought must set aside all such presuppositions about itself and the world if it is to discover the true nature of things, of being itself. How, though, is such Hegelian thought to proceed to further insights? What is the method of Hegel's speculative logic? Hegel's answer is clear. If more is to be learned about being, that more must arise because being determines itself in our thinking. As he puts it, I quote, it can only be the nature of the content that moves itself in scientific cognition. The method of Hegel's logic thus consists in letting being determine itself. Again, I quote, if pure being is taken as the content of pure knowing, then the latter has to step back for its content and allow it free play, ihn für sich selbst gewähren zu lassen, without determining it further. In other words, we must become passive in our thinking of being and of the idea that being proves to be. Number 11. Philosophical thinking proceeds analytically in that it simply takes up its object, the idea, and lets it go its own way, dieselbe gewähren lässt, while it simply watches the movement and development of it, so to speak. To this extent, philosophizing is wholly passive, and you think of the bit in the phenomenology about reines Zusehen, simply looking on. As we proceed through Hegel's logic, however, we follow the movement of being itself. So as we proceed through Hegel's logic, therefore, we follow the movement of being itself. Yet being proves to be not just pure being, but quality, quantity, essence, and eventually self-determining reason, or what Hegel calls concept, Begriff, or idea, Idee. From the perspective of the end of Hegel's logic, therefore, the movement of being is to be understood as the movement of the concept, or the self-movement of the absolute idea. Such self-movement, in turn, incorporates the self-movement of all the categories that emerge from being, categories that are not only forms of being, but also forms of thought or concepts. The concept, Begriff, is thus one of many concepts in Hegel's logic. Yet note that for Hegel, we as thinkers are not purely passive in speculative logic, but are also active, for we set out the movement of being. We do so by rendering explicit what's implicit in a category, and thereby bringing a new category to the fore. Indeed, Hegel writes, number 12, the whole course of philosophizing is nothing else but the mere positing, setzen, of what is already contained in a concept. Yet our activity of rendering explicit, or positing, is wholly determined by what's implicit in each category, and so by what each itself makes necessary. Through our activity, therefore, we follow passively the logical development or self-movement of the activities themselves. As Hegel notes out, and I think Heidegger picks up on that, passivity takes effort. You've got to actively commit yourself to it. You can't just lie back and let it happen. Schopenhauer appears unaware of the active side to Hegel's method. Yet he comes close to the truth when he says that for Hegel, human beings, I quote Schopenhauer, only had to give free play, dialectical self-movement to their thoughts to reveal all the mysteries of heaven and earth. Furthermore, he's right that in setting out the self-movement of concepts, Hegel rejects the familiar method of asserting a proposition and adducing reasons for it. Yet he fails to understand, or is simply unmoved by, Hegel's reasons for rejecting the method of adducing reasons. For Schopenhauer, that method just is the proper way to think. All judgments laying claim to truth must have a ground for knowledge. For Hegel, however, any grounds or reasons we give for our thoughts and judgments are themselves in need of further reasons, and so on ad infinitum. So thinking on the basis of reasons, I quote, admits of no certain and ultimate ground. Whatever reasons we adduce in our thinking, therefore, rest ultimately on ungrounded assumptions, and so are ultimately no more than assumptions themselves without proper justification. Thinking on the basis of reasons is not as rational as it thinks it is, and there are little anticipations here of Wittgenstein later in On Certainty. As we've seen, Hegel's alternative to such thinking is to set all assumptions aside and begin from indeterminate being, and then to render explicit what is made necessary by such being, that is, to do speculative logic. Since such logic articulates what is necessary in being and thought, and does so without prior assumptions, it is, in Hegel's view, thoroughly rational. Speculative logic is thus the space of pure reason, Vernunft, not a space of reasons, Gründe, since they are ultimately just assumptions for Hegel. Schopenhauer, however, ignores Hegel's reasons for preferring reason over reasons and sees in Hegel's dialectic only absolute nonsense. As already noted, Schopenhauer also considers Hegel's text to contain meaningless verbiage for another reason. He understands concepts to be abstracted from empirical intuition and to require such intuition to have content or meaning. But he rightly sees no empirical content in Hegel's logical categories. Yet for Hegel, categories have content in their internal logical complexity or concretion. and so do not, as Kant puts it, need to be made sensible, sinnlich, in order to have sense, Sinn. This, however, clearly doesn't count in Schopenhauer's mind. Hegel also differs from Kant and Schopenhauer in arguing that categories are not just forms of thought, but also belong to being itself. Indeed, he claims, they and their inherent dialectic structure nature and history. Neither of the latter is purely rational for Hegel. Nature in its impotence, Ohnmacht, is shot through with contingencies that continue to haunt history. Yet he thinks that reason or the idea, as well as causes identified by natural science, makes necessary different stages of nature, such as gravity, light, and organic life. And in history, too, the cunning of reason leads through the self-interested passions of individuals to the emergence of modern states that are, not perfectly, but more or less free. World history is therefore the progress of the consciousness of freedom. Hegel thus rejects Schopenhauer's claim that the basic qualities of the human heart and head remain unchanged, and he emphasizes the significant differences between the religious, political, and ethical practices of the Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, and moderns. Parce Schopenhauer, however, there is no shallow optimism in Hegel's view of history. Hegel doesn't overlook the obvious violence and suffering in history on which Schopenhauer focuses. Indeed, he calls history the slaughter bench, Schlachtbank, on which the happiness of nations and virtue of individuals are sacrificed. Yet he thinks that despite this violence, and sometimes through it, social and political institutions of genuine freedom have arisen in some modern states. States that are not just like beehives, but guarantee freedom of property, action, and profession. Hegel thus rejects Schopenhauer's grimly pessimistic view of history, which sees little in it but confusion and wreckage, Hegel's term. But he does not do so through optimism. Rather, Hegel detects in history's confusion a development often driven by passion, Leidenschaft, towards increasing human freedom. So, although Schopenhauer shows some familiarity with Hegel's thought, he clearly fails to do it justice, in my view. He does not, in Hegel's words, enter into the power of his opponent and place himself within the circle of his strength, but his aim is to expose Hegel as an unintelligent charlatan. Yet, even if Schopenhauer had understood Hegel, he would still have been dissatisfied, since some differences between the two thinkers are just so stark. First, Schopenhauer defends Kant's transcendental idealism, whereas Hegel rejects it and maintains that space and time, though indeed a priori forms of our intuition, also belong independently to nature itself. Second, Schopenhauer conceives of thought or cognition principally as the instrument of the will, whereas Hegel conceives of the human will itself, in contrast to instinct and desire, as thought's drive to realize its purposes in the world. Third, Schopenhauer commends the ascetic negation, Verneinung, of the will, which aims to extinguish bodily desires, and he sees such asceticism as the cornerstone of Christian ethics, and of course Nietzsche follows him later. Hegel, by contrast, rejects asceticism and the monkish virtues of chastity, poverty, and obedience, and he defends, as more truly Christian, the ethical, the Lutheran principles of marriage, rectitude, the virtue of earning a living through one's own work, and individual freedom, which entails obedience, but to what is ethical and rational rather than to divine authority. So, in these respects, it's hard to envisage any real reconciliation between Schopenhauer and Hegel, and so I'm not going to try any. Yet there are some similarities, even points of agreement between them, that are easily overlooked in Schopenhauer, if all you focus on is Schopenhauer's barrage of insults against Hegel. I'll start with some minor ones, but not important for the people involved. Both Hegel and Schopenhauer admire Dutch painting in the way that Schelling didn't, for example, and they admire the music of Mozart and Rossini. though Schopenhauer was clearly discomforted by the thought that Hegel shared his esteem for Mozart's magic flute. I think Schopenhauer, the thought that Hegel would have the same taste as Schopenhauer was just too much to bear. Famously, both Hegel and Schopenhauer endorsed Goethe's theory of colour, though bizarrely, Schopenhauer appears to blame Hegel for the failure of Germans to accept that theory. And what I think is most important, both are also critical of reductionism in science and philosophy, and insist that humans, animals, plants, and inorganic bodies cannot all be understood through the same physico-mechanical principles. There are, for both of them, different principles of determination at work in different beings. And I think Schopenhauer and Hegel, although they have different views about what those principles are, agree that reductionism is not the way to go. Both philosophers also emphasize that human subjectivity is embodied. Schopenhauer stresses repeatedly that an individual's cognition is mediated by the body, and Hegel too insists that thinking involves bodiliness, if I can pronounce it, is that right? Bodiliness, Leiblichkeit. And that consequently, and I quote, lack of habit and long continuation of thinking cause headaches. If you don't believe me, paragraph 410 remark of the Encyclopedia of Philosophy of Mind. You can think of the guy thinking away, think, oh, I need a drink and got a headache. So they both emphasize the bodiliness of cognition and subjectivity. Yet Schopenhauer appears to fall into a paradox that Hegel avoids. This is number 13. For Schopenhauer, cognition is mediated by the brain, indeed by the whole body. But the body itself belongs to the world of representation, Vorstellung, which only exists for the knowing subject. This apparent paradox, I think, is resolved by giving priority to transcendental idealism, according to which the knowing subject is the bearer of the world and the precondition of objects, including the body. So the idea that the body conditions cognition belongs essentially to the way this subject itself understands its body. It's not a statement made from some kind of outside objective point of view. It's how the subject interprets its own subjectivity as conditioned by the body, although the subject is ultimately the condition of there being a body at all. So I think that's how I would resolve that paradox. For Hegel, however, there's no paradox to resolve, for the knowing subject is not the condition of nature, but emerges from nature, which is itself the presupposition of spirit. A further similarity between Hegel and Schopenhauer is suggested by Schopenhauer's claim that love and compassion involve recognizing oneself in others, an idea also found in Hegel. Closer attention, however, reveals a significant difference between the two. For Schopenhauer, the self I recognize in the other is not my individual self, but the will that is identical and suffers in the same way in both of us. Indeed, what becomes apparent in compassion is that all individuality, though empirically real, is ultimately an illusion, belonging to the veil of Maya, and that we are all one will. For Hegel, too, mutual recognition involves recognizing one's identity with others, for example, as persons with rights. Yet I also recognize my own self in another self, whose individuality, Einzelheit, I recognize, and who recognizes mine in turn, and in neither case is such individuality illusory. For Hegel, therefore, in contrast to Schopenhauer, the consciousness of being different individuals belongs to and is not displaced by the recognition of a common identity. And individuals, in turn, are thus not irredeemably egoistic. Hegel and Schopenhauer also assign different roles to individuality in aesthetic experience. Both follow Kant in understanding the experience of beauty to be disinterested, and both depart from Kant by understanding such experience to be a form of cognition. Furthermore, both take this experience to bring to mind something universal that each calls idea. For Schopenhauer, ideas objectify the metaphysical will and include unchanging natural forces such as gravity and the unchanging forms and qualities of objects. These ideas are neither spatiotemporal nor subject to causality. So they express the will but are not caused by the will. But they manifest themselves in individual objects that are spatiotemporal. Ideas do so, however, only insofar as they're known by the subject under the a priori forms of its cognition, especially space and time, which constitute the principle of individuation. So the ideas for Schopenhauer do not give themselves the form of spatiotemporal individuality. They don't individualize themselves. Objects in nature and art are beautiful for Schopenhauer when they facilitate, erleichtern, the recognition of ideas. They do so through their individual features, the shape of a body or the actions of a dramatic hero, but the latter, those individual features, are not themselves the main focus of attention. Although individual objects are beautiful, they are so only for Schopenhauer because the subject sees the unchanging universal ideas in them and through them. In contemplating those ideas, the subject no longer desires individual objects or has a practical interest in them. It no longer relates such objects to its individual will. It thus sheds its own individuality and the a priori forms of cognition and becomes what Schopenhauer calls the pure subject of cognition. Now, of course, it doesn't become purely this pure subject because it sees the ideas in the individual spatio-temporal objects before it. Yet the aesthetic pleasure it enjoys resides in being released from individual desire and its attendant suffering, in being in part the pure, will-less, painless, timeless subject of cognition that sees the ideas in the spatio-temporal objects before us. Now you will, those of you who know Nietzsche, will recognize that phrase, the pure, will-less, painless, timeless subject of cognition, because Nietzsche lays into it in the Genealogy of Morals. For Hegel, beauty is the sensuous scheinen of the idea, specifically of the idea of freedom. In contrast to Schopenhauer's ideas, however, the universal, as Hegel conceives it, individuates itself, and so informs individuals through its own logic, rather than through being known by a subject. Remember, in the beginning of the Begriffslogik, you don't just have, universal, particular, and individual. You have the universal particularizing and individuating itself. There's a process there. And this is important for Hegel's aesthetics. So, as Hegel remarks, the animal doesn't exist, but is the universal nature of individual animals. Freedom as something universal thus also necessarily takes individual, especially human form in art and life. In art, individuality is indeed idealized and lacks the warts and all of everyday reality. But beautiful characters remain independent individuals, even when, as in Greek drama, they're moved by universal powers, such as the family or state. Aesthetic contemplation for Hegel thus cherishes an interest in the object in its individual einzeln existence. Art also addresses spectators as concrete individuals in their specific historical circumstances, not as pure timeless subjects. For this reason, Hegel maintains artworks must sometimes be revised to suit particular audiences. Yet, somewhat like Schopenhauer, Hegel thinks that genuine art elicits what he calls a theoretical response, in which we look or listen without desire and without feeling moved to practical action. Desire, Hegel states, cannot let the object persist in its freedom, but seeks to use it or consume it. Aesthetic contemplation, by contrast, is of a liberal kind, liberale art, that lets individual objects be what they are without subordinating them to my interest, and that delights in the freedom and life they express. For Hegel, therefore, we take aesthetic pleasure in free individuals themselves, not just as for Schopenhauer, by looking through individuals to the ideas they manifest. Now, more should be said about each of these examples, but I'm going to end with two further similarities between Hegel and Schopenhauer that can perhaps resolve two problems in Schopenhauer's thought. So what I'm going to suggest here is that actually Hegel can help resolve problems in Schopenhauer's thought. I'm a great one, generally, for trying to take philosophers at their strongest and not simply just saying, well, the guy's incoherent. And I think it is possible to make sense of some of the tensions and apparently blatant contradictions in Schopenhauer, and I'm going to use Hegel to help me do it. So let's see how this works. The first problem is this. How can Schopenhauer claim to know that the thing in itself is will? In Kant's view, we know nothing about things in themselves except that they're not in space and time, because the latter, as a priori, are merely subjective conditions of sensibility. In Schopenhauer's view, however, I know that my body in itself is will, and I can then infer by analogy that every other object in itself is will too. But what justifies Schopenhauer's claim? As subject of cognition, he writes, I find myself to be one with my body, and thus to be an individual. But my body is given in two entirely different ways. Once as representation, as an object among objects, and once as inner will. More specifically, when another object affects my body, I feel pleasure or pain within the latter, which are immediate affections of the will, the momentary willing or not willing of the impression the body is undergoing. That's Schopenhauer. These feelings are not themselves representations. Feelings are not objects like my body there in space. They are what I feel, as it were, on the inside of my body. As Rudolf Malter puts it, he's a Schopenhauer scholar of great eminence, in the horizon of representation, the experience of my body, there arises something non-representational, nicht vorstellungshaftes. Accordingly, I take this inner will, which is distinct from representation, to be what my body is in itself. Yet I know my will only in its individual acts, which is to say in time. I know it only in its appearance. There is, however, a distinction for Schopenhauer between appearance and the thing in itself. So how can I claim that my will is not just an appearance, but what my body is in itself? The answer lies in Schopenhauer's quasi-Hegelian concept of the in itself. And I'm not complaining Schopenhauer ever got any of this from Hegel, but there are surprising parallels in the way that they understand the in itself, at least in one respect. In his logic, Hegel argues that what something is in itself is not hidden, but shows itself in the thing's relations to other things. In other words, essence must appear. Essence is self-revealing. Now, Schopenhauer has a similar conception of the thing in itself and appearance, for he understands the thing in itself to be what appears in appearances, das in ihr Erscheinende. Appearance, in turn, is the manifestation of what appears. This conception allows Schopenhauer to claim that the will within us is not mere appearance, but manifests our essence, manifests the thing in itself that is itself will. It also allows us to consider how, besides our own body, other objects to whose inside we do not have access express and manifest the will. So just again, for Schopenhauer, the thing in itself is what appears in appearance, das in ihr Erscheinende. It is manifest in appearance. And so what we feel within ourselves, which ultimately belongs to appearance, can be regarded as a manifestation of the will. So we can understand the thing in itself to be will. Yet, Schopenhauer retains a Kantian understanding of the in itself alongside his quasi-Hegelian conception. For Schopenhauer, the will in itself manifests itself in appearance as the will we feel within ourselves, yet it manifests itself precisely in the very thinnest covering, Verhüllung, the form of time that belongs to appearance. And an aspect of the will thus remains hidden and unknown. We can never know, therefore, what the will is in itself, quite apart from the fact that it's cognized as will, quite apart from the way it appears. In this way, Schopenhauer combines a quasi-Hegelian and a Kantian conception of being in itself. Number 14. For him, the thing in itself is will, and it manifests itself and it appears as will. But this manifestation of the will does not exhaust or completely disclose the latter. If one bears this in mind, Schopenhauer's claim that we know the thing in itself to be will through its appearance in us is not as internally inconsistent as one might think. The second problem is the following. According to Schopenhauer, the metaphysical will objectifies itself as the ideas. It objectifies itself, however, for the knowing subject that is the correlate of the ideas and knows them as they appear in space and time. This subject of cognition as a subject does not itself objectify the will. Yet it is, I quote, ultimately the will itself or its expression, because it arises from the will with the ideas. Since the subject of cognition is ultimately the will itself or its expression, the will thus knows itself in the subject's knowledge of the world, or the world is the self-cognition of the will. If, however, the subject is an expression of the will, how can it detach itself from the will in aesthetic experience and aestheticism and achieve will-less cognition? Looking at Schopenhauer through Hegelian eyes can again perhaps resolve the problem. There is a superficial similarity between the self-cognition of the will, described by Schopenhauer, and the process described by Hegel, through which absolute reason or the idea becomes self-conscious in human beings or spirit. Yet they're different processes, not least because Schopenhauer's blindly striving will is not rational in Hegel's distinctive developmental sense. There is, however, another similarity between the two processes. Hegel maintains that contradiction, Widerspruch, moves the world. It doesn't exhaust the world, since many contradictions in the latter get resolved, but it is found in the dialectic through which categories and phenomena turn into their opposites and so prove to be precisely what they're not. Contradiction for Hegel is thus a form of self-negation or negativity. Schopenhauer also asserts that the will is characterized by inner self-contradiction and inner conflict with itself. And it is tempting to understand such Schopenhauerian contradiction as negativity in a broadly Hegelian sense. If we do so, the will can be conceived as expressing its inner conflict and negating itself by giving itself in the ideas the objectivity it does not have in itself. The will also manifests itself in its objective appearance, but it manifests itself in what intrinsically it is not. As already noted, the subject of cognition, as the correlate of the will's objectivity, does not objectify or manifest the will in the way natural forces or objects do. Yet it too is an expression of will, an expression through which the latter knows itself. Equally, however, the subject as knowing subject is not itself will. It is thus will in the form of its utter negation, pure knowing. Note the difference between what we have here and what we considered a moment ago. The will in itself appears in subjective feeling as what it is, as will, albeit partly hidden. By contrast, the will manifests itself in objective ideas and in subjective cognition as what it is not, as its own negation. We're now on 15, and I've pretty much given you the rest of the paper just because the next bit's a bit knotty. In embodied individuals, Schopenhauer insists, cognition serves the will's desires and interests. Yet in aesthetic experience and asceticism, the knowing subject detaches itself, or becomes detached, from such desires and turns into the pure, will-less subject. This detachment, however, simply renders explicit that the subject as knowing is already the negation of will, the will as its own negation. There is therefore no inconsistency in the idea that this subject is an expression of the will that can detach itself from the will. It can do so because as knowing subject at all, it is will that has negated itself, will that is not will. Now, there is, of course, a difference between aesthetic experience and asceticism for Schopenhauer. For only asceticism involves the free act of the will in which it altogether abolishes itself, sich aufhebt. This act, however, is made possible by the subject's altered mode of cognition. More precisely, the subject sees through the principle of individuation and recognizes the will as the source of all suffering. This insight, in turn, quietens the will with which the subject is identified, for it leads this will to feel loathing for its own essence and to turn away from itself. The will thus freely gives up, aufgibt, and negates the will to life, and thereby ceases willing, except for the last glowing spark that sustains the body. Yet this self-abolition, Selbstaufhebung of the will, does not leave absolutely nothing. It leaves the detached subject contemplating the relative nothing to which the objects in its world are reduced by the extinction of its will. In Hegelian terms, this detached subject is the will that survives its self-negation in the form of its own utter negation, non-will, pure knowing. Clearly, these points require further consideration. There is, however, a nice irony in the thought that Hegelian ideas might remove apparent inconsistencies from Schopenhauer's philosophy without thereby proving him right. Indeed, I hope to have shown that the relationship between Schopenhauer and Hegel is altogether more complex and interesting than Schopenhauer would have us believe. Thank you.